You're listening to Dodge Movie Podcast. Your hosts are Christy and Mike Dodge, the founders of Dodge Media Productions. We produce films and podcasts, so this is a podcast about films. Join them as they share their passion for filmmaking.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Dodge Movie Podcast, where we are talking about our 130th episode, the film Unforgiven from 1992, starring Clint Eastwood, Gene Hackman, Morgan Freeman, Richard Harris, and Frances Fisher. The film is directed by Clint Eastwood. The DP is Jack Green, who also worked with Eastwood on Bridges in Madison County and 13 other films. Coincidentally, he also was the DP on Serenity that we'll be talking about next week. And the film was written by David Webb Peoples, who also coincidentally wrote Blade Runner in '82 that we talked about last week. And then in 1995, he wrote 12 Monkeys. The synopsis for this film is a retired Old West gunslinger, William Munny, reluctantly takes on one last job with the help of his partner Ned Logan and a young man named the Schofield Kid. The tagline for this film is, "It's a hell of a thing killing a man."
Great tagline. That's a line of dialogue from the film, and it's one of the most iconic, so I like.
And it really is, upon my research, it very much falls in your theory because it does describe kind of like the big question for this film.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about Westerns and the themes found in Westerns. And traditionally, it's very much, if the bad guys kill somebody, that's what makes them bad guys, I guess. And the good guys, if they kill, it's only to protect people. But it doesn't really, most Westerns don't put very much emphasis on what happens to a person when they kill somebody. And that is what this film is kind of wrestling with. And in the scene, the Schofield Kid even, I mean, both him and William Munny kind of discuss the psychological effects on them since once they kill a person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that theme of it's a hell of a thing to kill a man also establishes, as we see in this film, how very few people are actually capable of that, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's a hell of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you kick us off with your pickup line, and then we'll talk about the film a little bit more.
Jesus. So I had a hard time getting a clear pickup line because the opening scene where we have dialogue, Strawberry Alice, who is a sex worker, is doing her job with a cowboy. Mm-hmm. And the sound isn't the best. And as you might imagine, they are not delivering clear dialogue. They are otherwise occupied.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so let me go over so that as we continue our conversation, it kind of fits within. One of the very first classes I took at film school was a genre class where we talked about all the different genres, and Westerns was one of them. And so typically in a Western, you see cowboys and you see gunslingers. They're often iconic characters in the West with the new frontier, and they're portrayed as rugged and tough and independent individuals who embody the values of that Western American frontier. Like I said, it's the frontier setting with the open landscapes and wide open spaces. There's often saloons where gambling is occurring and they can drink, and they often get into fights in the saloon, as well as, there's the female companionship is often found in the saloon. They're often on horseback because that was a common mode of transportation in the Westerns. And that also gives the sense of freedom and independence. There's shootouts and showdowns, gunfights between the good and the bad. And there's very much this clear, You're either a good guy or a bad guy. You're either with the law or against the law. There are marshals and sheriffs and other lawmen trying to bring justice, but then there's the lawless, the bad element that we're trying to keep out of the town. There's a common theme of revenge sometimes in Westerns. And then very much, like I mentioned before, kind of the morality of it, and the honor of what the good guys are fighting for. And then there's always the lone hero, the one who stands up and fights for justice, even in the face of great danger. So these are all things that commonly happen in Westerns. And Unforgiven kind of checks a lot of those boxes. But the one thing that it did do was kind of look at the killing aspect. And ironically, Gene Hackman did not want to take this part because he felt like he had been in quite a few movies that glorified violence, and he just was getting a bad taste in his mouth with it. And this was 92, so there was some things politically maybe that was going on. Wasn't that right about the time of Rodney King and kind of the abuses, I think?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. Oh, in fact, it was, because when Gene Clint asked him, read the script one more time. I think we can actually make a statement against the violence. And so then Gene agreed, and Clint told him to model Little Bill Daggett, his character, on then Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates. And the Rodney King beatings were, the March previous to this film coming out. So probably they were on the heels of that when they filmed this.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I feel like the character of Little Bill, played by Hackman, is one of the more violent characters in the film.
Right. And it's interesting because in when I do my research, Clint said that Hackman's character just wanted to kind of finish building his house, and he kind of wanted to retire, and he didn't want to get involved in all of the violence. Yet, like you said, his character is pretty violent, and it's almost like he would rather just stay at his cabin along the river. But when he comes to the town and has to do his sheriff duties, it's almost like another personality shows up.
Which is probably a good lesson on people in power, right? They're just people, but then they have this persona, but we have to be careful what that persona is, because it can get away from who they are as a person. But you mentioned earlier when talking about Westerns, kind of the honor and morality and justice, they established that through a line of dialogue, I think, that English Bob shoots Chinese folk. Like, that's his... I couldn't tell if it is his vocation or a hobby.
Right.
But that's not necessarily a good guy.
Nope.
So when Little Bill says, "Give me your gun," and then beats the living crap out of him, we're not too cut up about it, because English Bob is a pretty bad dude. We've kind of established that. So they show the Little Bill as kind of, maybe someone would say like Daryl Gates, not entirely good, not entirely bad, right? Because him whooping English Bob and sending him out of town certainly made the Chinese folk happy, but that's a bad dude. Getting him out of town is kind of, worth it. But then you see his behavior later when he refuses to apply kind of the same effort to when the poor prostitute gets cut up, and he's like, okay, well, give some horses to the pimp and we'll call it even. That is so far from justice, right? To show in that one character. And I do recall reading that this script was unmade for many, many years. And I think it's fascinating. Is it possible that it needed that kind of time and place for Eastwood to have the right perspective on the screenplay and for everybody involved to be where they needed to be to make this film?
It's possible. Eastwood bought the rights for this, I don't know when, but early enough that he felt like, I'm too young to play this part, which honestly, I felt like he kind of was maybe a little bit too old, because at his age, I didn't buy that, well, I guess those two kids seemed awfully young for him to be dad.
And his wife died at 29, according to the gravestone, and that wasn't too long before we saw him. So he would have been significantly older than her. Maybe that was reasonable at that time, though.
Right. So basically he threw it in a drawer and kind of forgot about it. And then somebody approached him, I can't remember who, and said, maybe it was, I think it was the I don't think it was the writer. I think it was Jack Green, maybe. But somebody approached him and said, hey, you ought to make that movie that you bought a while back. And I think he kind of forgot about it. And then he was like, oh, yeah. It was almost like, now I really better hurry. And
right, yeah. How much did I pay for that? Oops.
Yeah. This definitely has, it's got the horses, it's got the wide open spaces. We've got cowboy hats. We have a town that, a lot of Westerns are centered around a town and creating law and order in that town, which is funny because the minute you put up a saloon, I feel like you're going to have trouble with law and order.
Right. And I'm pretty confident that at that time, prostitution was not legal. So, having law and order with a publicly visible, right, wide open brothel is kind of an interesting perspective. Mm-hmm.
So it says, from Wikipedia, it says, like other revisionist Westerns, Unforgiven is primarily concerned with deconstructing the morality, black and white vision of the American West that it was established by traditional Westerns within the genre. And then David Webb Peoples says that the script is saturated with an unnerving reminders of Munny's own horrific past as a murderer and a gunfighter haunted by the lives he's taken. And I would say at the very end there, when he is dying himself and kind of, I think, is probably fearing what they believed at the time would happen, the reckoning. I think he was nervous about that and scared, quite honestly, when he was talking to Ned, his buddy.
Yeah, it's interesting to call it revisionist. I mean, I guess it's revisionist in the sense of it's not Gene Autry with the white hat and the pretty girl that he gets at the end of the film, because I actually think this is probably more representative of what it really was like in the West. I don't want to get too far into the philosophy of this, but I believe that the vast majority of people in the West were probably pretty peace-loving, good people. And of course, there were some remarkably bad dudes, but my guess is they were few and far between, simply because society couldn't function if every town was continuously getting shot up by people. So to me, showing that this Bill Munny, this guy, or Will Munny, I'm sorry, who is a notorious and prolific killer, right? He would have been really fairly solitary and unique. There wouldn't have been many like him. And I think this film represents that even like a guy like an English Bob who did kill people, he was not in the class of Eastwood's Will Munny as far as the danger, right? That guy was like pretty singular in his deadliness. And that, to me, makes sense. I don't consider that revisionist of actual history, but certainly for the genre, it's a different take.
Mm-hmm. I think it says that Clint and the screenwriter didn't set out to make an anti-violence movie. It says he was more interested in deconstructing the myth of the Old West with its clear distinction of heroes and villains, kind of like what you were saying. And he wanted to show an inglorious depiction of death. And so, especially when we first meet Munny and he's proposed by the Schofield Kid to come, he sees he needs to provide for his kids. And I think, he kind of is like, he justifies it because this is a way he knows how to make money. And then he's able to provide for his kids. So it's almost like he justifies it in his mind that it's worth it this one last time.
Right, definitely. Also, as I saw it, the way it was shot, one of the deciding factors was the description of the damage done to the prostitute, which of course was exaggerated, like we all know happens. And then he would tell Ned and the other people, like, this is what they did to her. And so that sense of morality does come into play as another factor. But you're right, the money was kind of a thing, and that's all he had going for him. And I really liked Eastwood's choice to show him falling on his face in the mud chasing pigs, because it's so humbling, right? They don't, again, we don't see him as kind of the John Wayne character who's in charge of everything. He's just this guy rolling around in the mud with these pigs.
And then at the very beginning, he can't get on his horse. It's like something that every cowboy in every Western, they just, they put their foot in that stirrup and they just throw that leg over and they make it look so easy. I think anybody who has tried to get on a horse, you realize how difficult it is. And when he can't even get that horse to stand still so he can stand up and throw his leg over, it's embarrassing. We're all like kind of embarrassed for him.
And it comes back later to put him at risk. But you're right, kind of taking those parts of the cowboy myth and evaporating them. But then kind of the other part that I thought was where we see they're going to get one of the cowboys who harmed the girl, and Ned can't pull the trigger because even though they did some bad things when they were younger, he doesn't have it in him anymore, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because later the Schofield Kid shoots a guy, and I don't think he kills him right away. And Clint says, shoot him again, shoot him again. And the kid can't do it. And so Clint picks up his rifle and he shoots him really fast. And there's something about it that made me feel like it's almost kind of like the honor is to do it in a way that is quick and painless. Like, okay, we have to kill this guy, but let's do it humanely. And I had this feeling when I was watching it, and I was later, my feeling was correct. Clint said, like, he referenced that kind of like the time when, he had to kill the guy. It was almost like killing livestock or putting an animal down to put it out of its misery. And so I very much, my reading was correct. And I thought that was an interesting kind of take also.
And there's the bit at the end where he talks throughout the film about how all these other killings, he didn't remember most of them because he was drunk at the time. So as a viewer, when we see Will Munny start drinking again, we know, oh, it's on, right? Because he's going back into that place. And then also it's a commentary, though, from what Eastwood is saying, is that killing is less about the physical skill and more about the psychological mindset. And even the character talks about that, right? He has a line in there about something like, shoot as fast as you can without missing. Basically, that the key isn't so much the quick draw, which is another, common trope, or these other things, but it was the ability to, in that situation, think calmly and shoot straight. And very few people have that. So that was his kind of power, where he was in, this saloon with all these people who are armed, and you would think, well, this is a matter of a few seconds and he's going to be shot up. But we know from military combat and police shootings that most people miss with all of their shots.
Right. So is there anything else about either the writing or the cinematography in this that you want to talk about?
Well, the writing, this is not a funny movie, but it had a couple of funny kind of bits about it. And one that I really enjoyed was the Duck of Death, where the very stereotypical nerdy writer, and dare I say Jewish, he looked to be, that's where they were going. He wrote a book about English Bob, and he called him the Duke of Death. And Gene Hackman kept pronouncing it as the Duck of Death. So that was funny on several levels. One, it reminded me of a certain president who kept referring to him as Saddam, right? The schoolyard, like 9-year-old taunt of mispronouncing someone's name. But then also, to me, the Duck of Death, It just is like an Affleck callback. I thought it was kind of funny. So what little bits of humor there are somewhat dark, right? And we see the other line that I thought was unintentionally hilarious is Little Bill says to Will Munny, "You just shot an unarmed man." And Will Munny replies immediately, "He should have armed himself."
Right, I like
and
that.
And that was, it was kind of a
we
a
both
fun
chuckled
line.
when that happened.
Yeah. I noticed there was a lot that Eastwood and the DP played with lighting a lot. As far as like, it's almost somewhat more the sets as well, but the whorehouse was so tight. Mm-hmm. The hallways and with all the people and the doors, it was very tight. And any place in that saloon, right, was probably realistically, but it was poorly lit. Mm-hmm. And we saw when the Schofield Kid comes to Will Munny's house, I thought it was fascinating that the kid was lit really well, but Munny was just silhouetted, right? And so I thought that was an interesting thing to show that he was almost kind of a shadow of himself. And this other kid was the one who was real and three-dimensional. And there was a fair amount of silhouettes in there and some pretty high contrast shots. But you mentioned the open expanses, and they had several of the shots, but one of them that really stuck out to me was that after the Schofield Kid shoots the guy in the latrine, which again is deflating the myth of these larger than life. Like this guy was literally caught with his pants down.
And isn't it for the Schofield Kid, it's not that honorable because it was, it's like punching a guy from behind.
Right. Yeah. And so after that, there's a wide shot where the Schofield Kid is sitting down at the base of a tree, and Will Munny is standing and talking to him, and they're all in silhouette. It's such kind of a classic Western looking shot. Mm-hmm. And then they cut to the Schofield Kid. Really, he may have even been crying at that time. He's struggling with the impact of what he's done. And I think that's where Will Munny gives the line, "It's a hell of a thing to kill a man. You take all he's ever had and all he'll ever have." So I thought that was the way they shot it was really, it called back to those tropes, but kind of inverted them a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So a couple bits of trivia. The boots that Clint Eastwood wore are the same ones he wore in Rawhide in 1959. They're part of his personal collection. And in 2005, they were loaned to the Sergio Leone exhibit at the Gene Autry Museum. And Clint it basically bookended his career in Westerns. He was a huge Sergio Leone fan. In fact, one of the tombstones says S. Leone in the cemetery as kind of a nod because he worked with him in all the spaghetti Westerns. And
right. I'm thinking Fistful of Dollars and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And I'm curious, that's kind of the first things I remember Eastwood from. So did that kind of break his career? Is he did the spaghetti Westerns and then he came back to Hollywood and had enough juice to do the things we know him for after that?
Yeah, he did a couple things, but yeah, it was mostly the Westerns and he credits Sergio Leone not only for teaching him kind of good direction, being a good director, but also for his career. To maintain the feel on the set, no motor vehicles were allowed. And so everything had to be brought, everything from equipment to people, food was brought in by a horse and wagon because Clint wanted everyone to feel the primitiveness of the set of the town.
Right. I wondered if trains counted. Could they put the camera equipment on a train car and bring it in that way?
It was only 6 miles, but
okay,
still, that's what.
Oh, what about star wagons? Were they allowed to be on set if they were towed in by horses?
I don't believe so. When I saw the behind the scenes, it looked it was that primitive. I think that star wagon would take away, from.
Yeah, sure. Was hair and makeup in a tent then? Fascinating. I love this idea.
The town was built from scratch in 32 days up in Alberta, Canada. Clint was in Alberta earlier on a film, and he was like, if I ever make a Western, this would be a beautiful part of the, country to make one in. So
I wonder if the Carpenters really miss Westerns because they always have to build the town when they shoot a Western.
Right. They get lots of work.
And maybe it's fun because you get to build different things. You build a saloon, a barber place, the sheriff's office with the jail. Like, it just seems like maybe a church at the end of the street. So here's another question.
Yeah.
Maybe one of our super fans can help us out. There is very much a standard floor plan to Western towns in movies. But how accurate was that? Like, I mean, as we've established before, Hollywood is not necessarily accurate. They could, cheat in 1,000 different ways to make the movie easier or cheaper to shoot. So I'm just curious, was there kind of a standard floor plan? Or was it just, no, we in Westerns, we've decided that, the church goes at the end of the street and the saloon's here and the stable's there, that kind of thing.
No, it's a great question. And I don't know the answer. Although I believe that so there's a set in Tucson, Arizona where they film many Westerns. In fact, that's where they filmed Tombstone.
Yeah, and that might explain it, right? Is if they use the same set over and over again. I was wondering if maybe on the Warner Brothers backlot in Burbank, there is a common, like a street they use for it or what have you. If you recall in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, they are shooting a Western at one point, and I thought that was on the studio lot.
Yeah, I know. I think it's Warner Brothers has a studio as a lot where there's a Western set. And then I know outside of LA North, I believe there's ranches that they commonly would film Westerns at.
And I think there's even one down near Eugene in Oregon where they filmed a couple of Westerns back in the day.
I know there's locations, but I don't know if there's like a standing set. Is that what you mean?
I thought it was standing there as a ranch, but I could be wrong.
Oh, interesting. So one fun thing that I thought you would enjoy, and I will include the photo in our show notes because it's just funny. But so there's a scene where William Munny, Ned, and the Schofield Kid are all on horses, and they're talking to one another, and they're fighting about like kind of what should be done next. Have you ever thought, how do they keep the horses still while they have this argument and fight?
I have never thought of that, but that's a very good question.
Because the horse is going to kind of move around, and then you're in focus and out of focus, right?
Yeah.
So what they do is they shoot some scenes on horseback, and then they put the actors, they straddle ladders.
Not even saddles? Mm-mm. Oh, that's hilarious.
So Morgan and the Schofield Kid and Clint are all sitting, and I'll include this picture.
Oh, that's priceless.
They're all sitting on ladders in the field with the camera so that they can have this argument.
And the right height.
And they're the right height. But just imagine, because horses don't stand perfectly still. So I wonder if they have to like kind of gesticulate with their torso to mimic the horse kind of moving around. So
now I'm immediately thinking of when they put them in a car and they're not really driving and they make all the ridiculous hand motions on the wheel. And I will never be able to watch a horseback argument again without thinking of this.
Right. Looking for shooting just above the head of the horse.
Yeah.
To try to sell it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then like an overactor like me would then like wave away a horsefly or something really over the top. Cut. Okay. Dodge. None of the horsefly action. Okay. Back to one.
Was there any head trauma in this film?
Yeah, there's a little bit. Well, okay. So the kind of opening inciting incident, there is some knife trauma to the poor prostitute's face, which is a head-related thing.
Very sad.
Prostitutes throw horse apples at the cowboy's head when he tries to buy them off with a horse later. Little Bill punches English Bob in the face before kicking the crap out of him. Little Bill pistol whips Will and then kicks the crap out of him. And then there's lots of shooting, which very little I think is in the head. I think most of it's in the torso.
And I don't believe we have a romance in this film.
Smoochie, smoochie, smoochie. We do not have any romance smoochie. There's a line, just because we let those smelly fools ride us like horses don't mean we got to let them brand us like horses. That kind of establishes there's not a lot of romance in this film.
The ladies didn't fare so well.
They didn't. And, maybe that's realistic, but it made me sad nonetheless.
Very much so. And no driving.
No driving. There are no vehicles on the set even. I don't know enough about horseback riding to give a horseback riding review, although I did read that in order to get the horse to not let him on, Clint would pull back on the left rein alone to get it to turn instead of letting him stand up in the saddle.
So I do know a listener named Adrian that if she wanted to, could probably comment on the horseback riding.
Yeah. I was thinking of this while watching another film recently, that actors in Westerns must be fairly skilled horsemen and horsewomen because we see them in the wide shot so much. It would be hard to fake that, I think. And that's probably not a skill that's very common anymore.
Right. I agree with you. I think Clint, and in some of the other films that we're talking about this month, I think I saw behind the scenes, and Val Kilmer was, they had to go back to one, and it was a scene where him and Kurt Russell are riding their horses, and watching Val go back to the starting place. He looked very comfortable on that horse. And I was like, oh, wow, I bet that's kind of fun. It's, I know it's hard to work with animals and sometimes they don't cooperate, but you don't just mosey back to one. You get to ride your horse back to one. I was like, that looks fun.
Now, I don't know the very specifics of this, but I am aware that cavalry, people who would fight on horseback, were able to direct the horse with just their knees and their weight because they needed their hands for the fighting parts, which is a level of horsemanship that I think would be very difficult it would take, I would think, thousands of hours of practice to get there. And so credit to Mr. Kilmer and any of these other actors who are able to the layperson, or not to the layperson, to an experienced person like listener Adrian, to pull it off, right? Because I don't feel like I have enough knowledge to distinguish whether somebody's really doing it right. But I bet if you're an accomplished equestrian, you look at the screen and you're like, they know what they're doing, or that guy's an idiot.
Right. Yeah, like you do with all the
driving,
coding scenes.
et cetera. Yeah.
All right, shall we go to the numbers?
Let's go to the numbers.
All right, just before we do, I want to tell you that this film ranked number 4 on the American Film Institute's list of the greatest films in the genre of Western in June of 2008. So we picked a winner, so let's see if audiences agreed. The budget for this film was $14.4 million. And domestically, it brought in $101.1 million. So that is
7x.
Yeah. And then worldwide, $159 million, which that's an 11x. Adjusted for today, that would be like $223.6 million. So I would say it did quite well. It scores very high on IMDb, 8.2 out of 10. Critics love this movie at 96%, and audiences aren't that far behind at 93%. It's a little long, so you might need a pee break at 2 hours, 10 minutes. It's rated R, and it is classified as a drama Western. It won many awards. It's a Warner Brothers picture. It won 50 awards and got 47 nominations. Among them, it won the Oscar for the Best Picture. Gene Hackman won for the Best Supporting Actor, and Clint Eastwood won for the Best Director. This movie laid to rest Clint Eastwood's longstanding statement why he would never win an Oscar. He said he reckoned that he would never be in the running, first because he's not Jewish, and second because he makes too much money, and thirdly because he doesn't really give a bleep. So since his double Oscar win for this movie, he has gone on to win 2 more, as well as the Irving Thalberg Memorial Award, and has been nominated an additional 6 times. We watched this on Apple for $3.99. So I don't think it was available anywhere else. Okay, that just about does it for this second week of August films. Please send in your guess as to what you think. We did Blade Runner last week, Unforgiven this week. Next week, we're doing Serenity, followed up by Tombstone. So you can make a guess in the email, Christy@dodgemediaproductions.com. And never forget,
Dodges never stop, and neither do the movies.
Thanks for listening to Dodge Movie Podcast with Christy and Mike Dodge of Dodge Media Productions. To find out more about this podcast and what we do, go to dodgemediaproductions.com. Subscribe, share, leave a comment, and tell us what we should watch next. Dodges never stop, and neither do the movies.